Hey guys, tonight we drift back to 14th century Japan, where the trees are thick, the politics are thicker, and one young royal is about to sleepwalk his way through one of the most confusing power struggles in history. Lanterns glow dimly in mountain retreat. You hear the constant drone of cicadas, and at the center of it all is a boy named Norinaga, who will grow up to become Emperor Murakami, one of the most politely ignored emperors in all of Japan. No big battles, no grand palaces, just endless scrolls, muddy sandals, and a very long game of political hide-and-seek. You're going to love it here, if you enjoy mild anxiety and waiting for people to return your messages. Spoiler, they rarely do. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where and when you're listening. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see this sleepy little community stretch across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not born into greatness. Not really. You're born in 1328, a year when Japan is, shall we say, going through some things. The imperial family has split into two branches: the Northern Court, backed by the military government in Kyoto, and the Southern Court, which doesn't really have a capital but does have a chip on its shoulder. You're born into that Southern Court. Your father, Emperor Go-Daigo, is a complicated man. One moment he's restoring imperial rule and proclaiming a new era. The next he's fleeing Kyoto with the sacred treasures stuffed into a travel bag. You, as his son, are just trying to learn your court etiquette without getting accidentally declared a political enemy. Nobody really expects you to rule, at least not for long. Japan has entered a phase of dynastic tug-of-war, where emperors are declared, deposed, and redrawn like lines in the sand. When you're a toddler, you probably hear whispers that being the emperor is a dangerous job, but you also probably hear that it's largely ceremonial these days. So silver lining. When you're about 4 years old, your father is booted from Kyoto by the Ashikaga clan. These guys are basically the bouncers of medieval Japan, armed to the teeth, loyal to themselves, and constantly flipping allegiance. They install their own emperor in the capital and leave your family to retreat to the mountains. Congratulations! You've now joined the elite ranks of people who rule but don't actually reign. By age 7, you're declared crown prince. Somewhere between learning your syllabary and picking a favorite incense scent, you also inherit a kingdom at war with itself. Most kids have imaginary friends. You have a shadow government and a traveling court. Your father dies in 1339, and just like that you become Emperor Murakami, an imperial name bestowed with all the ceremonial weight of a paper lantern in a typhoon. There's no grand ceremony, no golden throne, just a weary group of nobles and scribes murmuring your name in the misty halls of Yoshino, your forest-bound capital. The nearest thing to applause is the sound of bamboo creaking in the night. You might think this is your moment to shine, to rally troops, reclaim Kyoto, and restore the glory of the throne, but that would require armies, gold, and political influence. What you have instead are old poetry scrolls, seasonal incense, and a very committed calligraphy instructor. Still, you try. Your court issues proclamations. You perform the proper rites. You even try to summon loyalty from regional lords, many of whom respond with a polite, maybe later. It's like sending out wedding invites and getting back nothing but "will see." Your day-to-day life becomes a routine of quiet formality. You rise with the sun, consult your aging counselors, and spend hours carefully writing letters you're not entirely sure will arrive. On the best days, there's fresh tea. On the worst days, a landslide blocks the only decent path into your little mountain refuge. You are technically the Emperor of Japan, but in reality, you're Emperor of whichever hilltop hasn't been burned down yet, and you're just getting started. You sit on a cushion, legs tucked properly beneath your layered robes, as the scent of pine and worn lacquer fills the quiet chamber. It's another morning in Yoshino, or perhaps not exactly Yoshino. The truth is, your court moves around so much that even the scribes aren't always sure where you technically are. What they are sure of is this: there's another emperor in Kyoto, and he's not you. See, Japan is now in what historians politely call the Nanboku-cho period, or the era of northern and southern courts. A more honest label might be that time we couldn't agree on who was in charge. You rule the southern court, the Ashikaga clan backs the northern court, and Kyoto, the traditional imperial capital, sits smugly in northern hands. You've never stepped foot in Kyoto as emperor. Maybe you visited as a child, ran past the golden screens, spilled ink in a corner, but that was before everything fell apart. Now it's enemy territory. You read about it in poems, hear its name murmured in regret, but you know it only as a place you send letters to that don't get answered. This split, the two courts, the two emperors, isn't just about thrones and politics. It's about legitimacy, about who holds the imperial regalia, the mirror, the sword, and the jewel. Technically, you've got two of the three. The sword? Well, it got misplaced during a battle, or stolen, or dropped in a river. Historians still argue about that. Meanwhile, the Ashikaga-backed emperor in Kyoto throws ceremonies with all the regalia you don't have. He issues edicts that are frankly bolder than yours. He has soldiers, you have scholars. He builds things, you patch up old things. But here's the strange part. For many in Japan, both courts feel legitimate. Some samurai pledge loyalty to you, others side with the Ashikaga, still others just pretend neither court exists and do whatever they want. It's like trying to referee a game where the players refuse to admit the ball exists. Your days become a slow rhythm of rituals, as much about spiritual continuity as governance. You light incense, you chant sutra, you consult the stars, not for prophecy, but because it's Tuesday and that's what emperors do on Tuesdays. You attend poetry readings under the moonlight, where metaphors about rivers and autumn leaves stand in for your real worry. The court you oversee is small, tight-knit, and deeply ceremonial. You maintain the forms of high-end tradition even though the world around you has sprinted ahead into the age of steel and chaos. Your ministers wear archaic robes. Your scribes use scripts that haven't evolved in decades. You cling to ritual because ritual is the one thing no warlord can burn down. And through it all you write so many scrolls, letters to potential allies, appeals to wayward lords, blessings, thanks, condolences, edicts. You write until your brush aches, your wrist stiffens, your inkstone runs dry. You write because it's the only way to rule from a distance. Sometimes you hear rumors that your letters are intercepted. Other times a retainer returns to say a lord is considering your appeal. Once in a while a noble switches sides. More often they don't. You might wonder, lying on your futon at night, if you're really ruling anything, if you're more than a name on a scroll and a figurehead in the fog. But every morning the courtiers still bow to you. Every evening they await your presence at the subdued palace dinner. Even if the fish is dried and the rice half-cooked, you are still the emperor, just the one with fewer walls. Somewhere in the background, a flute plays a lonely melody, not because someone's celebrating, no. The court musician just likes to practice during supper. You sip your tea, nod at your ministers, and pretend not to notice the ceiling slowly. You stare out at the distant ridgeline, where mist clings to the trees like ghostly silk, and think for the 100th time that Kyoto must feel like another world. You're the emperor, yes, but you're the emperor of everywhere except the capital. Kyoto has the temples, the ancient palace, the seats of old learning and influence, but it also has the Ashikaga shogunate, the warlords who drove your father out and propped up their own puppet emperor. They hold the city like a prize, and every time you dream of returning, reality taps you gently on the shoulder and reminds you that's not happening anytime soon. The closest you've come to ruling Kyoto is hearing travelers describe it in passing. Oh, the ginkgos are shedding early this year, a merchant might say, bowing low before your throne of polished cedar. The bridges are stable again, someone else might offer, as if this is encouraging news. But those are just fragments of a city you'll never set foot in as emperor. The truth is, Kyoto has become symbolic, less a place, more a lingering ache. Your court in Yoshino, humble and often damp, is where real decisions happen. Or to be more accurate, it's where decisions might happen, if anyone had the power to enforce. The southern court exists in exile, an odd little pocket of legitimacy adrift in the mountains. You issue edicts from a palace that has paper walls, and sometimes goats chew on the messages before messengers can deliver them. There's even a tale in your court of a particularly aggressive one, eating a tax decree and becoming the de facto ruler of a hillside village. It's mostly a joke. Meanwhile, the Ashikaga-backed northern court in Kyoto does what dominant powers do. They build, parade, and occasionally pretend you don't exist, but they know you do. Every time your supporters lead a raid or a region declares for you, the shogunate has to respond. You are in many ways a ceremonial thorn in their armored side, but you're not without supporters. Some loyal samurai clans in the south rally to your cause, not necessarily because they love you, but because they oppose the Ashikaga more. It's less about loyalty to the emperor, and more about old grudges, family feuds, and the kind of petty regional politics that fill a historian's footnotes, but rarely make it into bedtime scrolls. Your court does what it can with what it has. You maintain ceremonies, observe proper seasonal rituals, and make a great show of imperial continuity. When cherry blossoms bloom, your poets write verses by candlelight. When autumn comes, the court dons their maple-patterned robes and holds poetry gatherings in the garden, well, in a cleared-out patch of forest that used to be a garden before the deer got to it. And always, the dream of Kyoto lingers in your word. You mention it often in court letters. When the capital is restored, upon our return to Kyoto, it becomes a kind of sacred refrain, like a lullaby sung by a parent who knows the child won't sleep, but sings anyway. Historians still debate whether you truly believed you'd reclaim the capital. Some argue you were a romantic, clinging to the vision of a restored throne. Others say you were pragmatic, using Kyoto more as a symbol to rally support than a destination you realistically planned to reach. And still others think you were just tired and trying to keep everyone calm. All are probably a little bit right. The longer your reign goes, the more obvious it becomes that this isn't a temporary exile. This is your reign. From a series of thatched halls tucked into the wooded slopes of Yamato province, you rule the southern half of a divided Japan. You govern through ink, incense, and the occasional surprisingly effective tea ceremony, and Kyoto remains out there just far enough to dream about, just close enough to haunt you. You wake early, not because you want to, but because the roof has sprung another leak. Again, it's the rainy season, and the court carpenters are 2 days behind on repairs. Again, you shuffle into your sandals, the straw edges softened by years of wear, and prepare for another day of ruling a country you can barely reach. Outside, the hillside is thick with damp mist, and the sound of frogs, which seem to have no opinion whatsoever about imperial politics. But within your traveling court there is quiet movement, scribes sharpening brushes, servants boiling rice, and ministers preparing another round of deliberations about things no one can change. You sit down at the low table, and a bowl of modest rice gruel is placed in front of you. There's one pickled plum, a luxury. You nod your thanks, even though you're thinking about the last time a tax shipment was actually delivered on time. Spoiler, it wasn't this year. Rice, in fact, has become one of your main concerns, not as a gourmand, but as a ruler whose currency is slipping between his fingers. You see, the southern court doesn't have its own mint, and since coinage is scarce, most of your economy runs on rice. But rice, as it turns out, is easier to promise than to produce. Your couriers return with messages like, "The harvest was poor this year," or "The local lord regrets to inform you he has been raided." Occasionally, a cart full of slightly moldy sacks does arrive, escorted by a dozen bowing samurai, with apologies, and perhaps one sheepish goat. You accept it all with a graceful nod, because emperors do not yell, they sigh, regally. Your court's survival depends less on strategy, and more on seasonal luck. If the rains are too strong, the roads flood and rot the stores. If the rains are too weak, the fields crack and yield nothing. You find yourself consulting Buddhist monks, not for spiritual guidance, but for weather forecasts, based on cloud shapes and moss behavior. And still, you try to govern. You send orders to local lords, urging them to remain loyal, to maintain peace, to send taxes. Sometimes they comply. Sometimes their messengers simply vanish into the woods. Once, one of your edicts comes back with a note scribbled on the back in charcoal: "Try again next moon." The handwriting is excellent. So you pivot again. Rather than trying to assert control through strength,
You lean into patience, you adopt the tone of a gentle but persistent grandfather, always reminding, never scolding. Your letters become legendary for their poetic structure and frustrating subtlety. One advisor jokes that your most powerful weapon is a beautifully phrased reminder of someone's past allegiance. There are minor victories, here and there. A wayward clan returns to the fold. A disputed border is resolved through, get this, an actual agreement, not a sword. You even receive gifts, lacquerware, old scrolls, and once, a very confused monkey. It escaped halfway through the presentation and is still somewhere in the forest, possibly founding its own dynasty. But mostly you wait. You do what emperors do when they're not in charge of anything visible. You maintain order, at least within yourself. You bow, you bless, you oversee the changing of the court wardrobe as the fifth moon gives way to the even though your sandals are patched and your robe was mended 3 times this year. You embody the form of an emperor with absolute consistency. Historians still argue whether this was wisdom or stubbornness. Some say you preserved the dignity of the throne in a time of chaos. Others suggest you were simply too cautious to risk a bold move. The truth, as usual, probably sits somewhere in a damp middle chamber, politely sipping tea while the roof leaks. And as the rain keeps falling, you think about your father, the bold Go-Daigo, who fought, fled, and flamed bright before disappearing into the fog of history. You, in contrast, are still here, quiet, unmoved, steady. Sometimes, not doing something is the action. You sit at the edge of your wooden veranda, feet just above the wet stones, watching the drizzle thread down from the thatched eaves like silver hair. It's quiet, except for the faint arguments in the council room behind you. Again, they're talking about the specifically Ashikaga Takoji. Again, now Takoji is complicated. To the history books he's either a cunning traitor, or a necessary stabilizer depending on who's right. But to you he's the man who seized Kyoto, forced your father out, and set up his own emperor like a mannequin in a throne room. He wasn't always a villain though. Early on your father trusted him, thought they shared a vision for imperial restoration. But then Takoji saw a power vacuum and did what ambitious warlords tend to do. He filled it with himself. While you live in quiet hills and issue imperial proclamations with elegant brushwork, Takoji builds castles, secures roads, and sends letters with a lot fewer metaphors and a lot more threats. It's not just that he opposes you, it's that he's created a whole other court, one with its own emperor, its own ministers, its own calendar. That's the Northern Court. And yes, it's in Kyoto, the seat of tradition and prestige. And yes, their emperor has most of the regalia. And yes, they're increasingly acting like you are the imposter. You would write them an angry letter if you thought it would get past the mountain bandits. Still, you have a secret weapon, sort of. You have Prince Kanyoshi. Now Kanyoshi is young, but he's spirit, your relative, maybe cousin, maybe nephew, depending on which branch of the tree you squint at. Kanyoshi leads your military efforts in the south, and while military efforts might be overstating it, he does occasionally manage to retake a province or surprise a garrison. But this relationship with your generals is tricky. They swear loyalty to you, but they don't always listen. Some of them use your name like a brand, slapping Southern Court loyalist onto their banners while pursuing their own feud. Others send reports so vague you're not sure if they've won a battle or opened a tea shop. You try to guide them with dignity. You call audiences. You offer ceremonial blessings before they depart on campaigns. You even compose poems for them, hoping a bit of classical flair will inspire honor. Sometimes they bow deeply and leave full of spirit. Other times, they bow deeply and ignore you completely. But it's not just military awkwardness. Even your court is fracturing in odd ways. There are whispers that some of your own nobles have family members serving the Ashik. One minister's son marries into a Kyoto clan. Another's brother quietly trades lacquerware across enemy lines. You pretend not to notice. It's easier that way. Your authority is real, but also theoretical. You are emperor by virtue of divine right and ancient lineage. But divine right doesn't get your horses fed, and ancient lineage doesn't impress a local warlord unless it comes with a cart of gold. So instead you focus on stability. You avoid major moves. You let your generals bluff their way through negotiations while you keep the court grounded in tradition. You maintain a slow, deliberate image of control like a duck gliding across a pond while paddling frantically below the surface. It's a strange kind of strength. Historians still debate whether this was tactical brilliance or quiet surrender. Some say you preserved the spirit of the imperial house through an era when it could have easily collapsed. Others argue you simply drifted with the current, unwilling or unable to change your course. But there you are, every morning, bowing at the small family shrine, listening to reports, writing edicts, hosting tea, always present, always calm, even while Ashikaga Takoji expands his power, reinforces Kyoto, and plays at building a dynasty of his own. And that's the thing about your reign. It's long, yes, but it's also deeply, deeply uneventful, not because nothing happens, but because everything happens elsewhere. You remain still, steady, not forgotten, but easily overlooked. It's almost admirable, almost.
You're sitting beneath a paper lantern. Its flickering glow casting soft light across a scroll of freshly brushed ink. Outside, a night breeze stirs the reeds, but inside, the palace is hushed. A minister clears his throat gently, preparing to discuss troop movements. But you're not interested in troops tonight. Instead, you ask about poetry. Yes, poetry. Specifically, the spring verses of Fujiwara no Taika. And whether a court competition might lift morale. The room hesitates, as if unsure whether this is a joke. It isn't. You've learned something about power. When you don't have it, ceremony is your armor. And so, you double down on the things that give your court its shape. Rituals, recitations, and refined distractions. You've held more poetry contests than battles. Your retainers can quote waka better than they can wield a spear. There's a scroll catalog of court lantern designs that now has its own storage chest. You find this oddly comforting. It's not just whimsy, it's preservation. By emphasizing the ancient arts, poetry, incense mixing, calligraphy, you're drawing a line between your court and the militarized chaos of the north. The Ashikaga may build fortresses, but you curate culture. And in Japan, culture matters. Or at least it used to. Of course, this doesn't mean your court is all plum blossoms and metaphor. Life is still hard. Supplies still thin. The court musicians, for instance, haven't received fresh strings for their kotos in months. One resorts to tying horsehair across the frame, creating a new genre of wind-affected tuning. You pretend to enjoy it, but despite the limitations, your court becomes a curious sanctuary. Scholars, poets, and monks gather here, escaping the dangerous dance of politics in the cities. You sponsor compilations of ancient texts. You issue new court ranks based on literary merit. You even restore parts of old imperial rituals, long abandoned by Kyoto. Your reign becomes a kind of living archive, a last breath of classical elegance in an age of iron and ambition. Still, not everyone appreciates it. One visiting general mutters, "The emperor plays with verses while castles burn." You hear this, you don't respond. But later that evening, you compose a haiku that gently compares a loud man to a frog during mating season. Your attendants chuckle politely. Historians still argue about this shift in your court. Some see it as noble resistance, a stand for refinement in barbaric times. Others think it was avoidance, the artistic equivalent of sticking your fingers in your ears during a war. But those historians weren't there when the moon rose over the ink garden and the nightingales sang through the open corridor. They didn't feel the peace of a room stilled by calligraphy. They didn't hear the silence after a perfect verse was read aloud, followed by the soft exhale of 20 people who all forgot just for a second how fragile everything was. And let's be honest, poetry has always been Japan's favorite way of pretending things are fine. You're simply the master of it. So you host another contest. You assign plum themes. You sip bitter tea and nod wisely. You pin the best verses to silk screens even as the roof sags. Let the generals sharpen swords. You'll sharpen brush tips. The morning mist hasn't yet lifted, and you're already deep in discussion, though discussion might be too generous a word. Your ministers drone through a list of updates. A river flooded in Kawachi province. A local lord has switched sides again, and someone's ox stole ceremonial rice. You nod, dignified and non-committal, while secretly wondering how to phrase a scroll about bovine treason. Another day of sovereign duty. But behind these routine notes lies a quieter truth, one that has followed you for years like a respectful shadow. You are the emperor, yet your commands hold as much sway as a polite suggestion from a retired librarian. You issue decrees, you stamp them with imperial seals, you phrase them beautifully, sometimes even with elegant seasonal references. But the results? Sometimes a local official complies, more out of courtesy than fear. Other times nothing happens at all. You write, they nod, the message disappears into the forest. You begin to wonder, what is power really? You wear the robes, you chant the prayers, you lead the ritual. But when it comes to enforcing will across the fractured provinces of Japan, the answer is clearer. Swords speak louder than scrolls. Ashikaga Takauji, your favorite recurring character, has plenty of swords. His army responds fast, moves efficiently, and most annoyingly continues to grow. He doesn't ask permission. He just shows up. His word doesn't float on incense. It rides in on horseback. Meanwhile, you host a ceremony to bless the spring planting. You're not without influence though. Some warrior clans still hold true to the southern court, partly out of loyalty, partly because opposing the Ashikaga makes them feel noble. Others stay neutral but secretly send gifts, hedging bets in case history favors you in the end. Still, every year your circle tight, core years take longer. Allies fade. One province, Shikoku, stops responding entirely, leaving you to wonder if they've defected or just run out of parchment. You try different tactics. You write more persuasive letters. You send envoys with tiny imperial tokens, folded fans, lacquered combs, things meant to whisper "I am still here" across the chaos. Sometimes it works. Sometimes your envoy gets mistaken for a merchant and charged bridge tolls. Your ministers grow anxious, but you remain composed. Because here's the strange thing. Even as your practical power fades, your symbolic power seems to grow. You become less a ruler, and more a myth. An idea preserved in ceremony and careful silence. People talk about you with reverence. They say your words have grace. They quote your poems at weddings. Your court becomes an island of continuity. While generals rage, you endure. While banners change and castles fall, your calligraphy remains legible. There's a strange strength in that. A stillness that unnerves the ambition. Historians still argue whether your passive resistance was strength or surrender. Some claim you lacked boldness. Others suggest you were playing the long game, letting the fire burn itself out while preserving the ember of imperial legitimacy. Maybe you weren't trying to win the game. Maybe you were just trying to outlast it. And you do. While warlords switch sides like dancers in a poorly rehearsed play, you remain the constant. The gentle emperor in the midst. The man who ruled without ruling, governed without force, and managed to leave behind a story where nothing seemed to happen. But everything still mattered. Even now, centuries later, your reign remains the soft heartbeat beneath a loud history. You're eating breakfast, if you can call it that. A cold rice ball slightly oversteamed, and tea so weak it could pass for mildly flavored water. Outside, the mountain air is crisp, and a procession of birds seem to be arguing about something. Inside, your ministers are arguing about something too. Again, it's logistics. Again, it's war. Not a war you're leading, of course. Just one unfolding near enough to be inconvenient, but far enough that you're unlikely to be captured. Probably. You've moved your court 3 times in 2 years. First from Yoshino to a more defensible ridge. Then from there to a lowland temple when water became scarce. Then from there to a repurposed villa after a suspicious fire took out 2 kitchens and a poetry archive. The scrolls were mostly smoke-damaged metaphors about chrysanthemums, but it still stung. Now you're here, nestled in the middle of what could generously be called a forest compound, and more accurately be called some buildings pretending to be a palace. You've become something of an expert in relocation. You no longer ask how long you'll stay in one place.
Instead, you ask which walls are least likely to collapse during the next storm. Still you carry on. With court rituals, with ceremonies, with the illusion of permanence. Each new location is blessed with the same solemnity as the last. Each change of season is marked by a new scroll. The tea is still served. The robes are still folded. The archery court, now a clearing behind the latrines, is still maintained. Barely. You know the Ashikaga want to capture you. It would be a political trophy. Maybe not as shiny as seizing Kyoto, but close. They've tried, of course. A few raids, a whisper of a night siege. One retainer even swore he saw an Ashikaga scout in the brush, but it turned out to be a lost deer with a twig on its head. Still, better safe than surrounded. You take precautions. Your court becomes mobile in ways no one ever expected from an imperial government. Horses are always ready. Messages are encoded in poetry. Important documents are copied and hidden in lacquer boxes, buried in spots only a monk with excellent memory could recall. Some nights you sleep in your robes, just in case. It's not glamorous. It's not even comfortable, but it's effective. Historians often marvel at how the Southern court endured for decades in the face of superior force. And the answer isn't magic. It's movement. Relocation as resistance. Flexibility as survival. You learn to read terrain. You value forests not for their beauty, but for how quickly they can conceal an imperial escape. You bless the trees. You bow to the hills. You become something between an emperor and a ghost. Half legend, half wandering hermit in silk sleeves. And still your courtiers follow. They grumble. Of course they grumble. The baths are inconsistent. The kitchen's tiny. And no one's had fresh ink in weeks. But they follow. Because despite everything, you remain composed. Calm. Even wry. Once during a particularly muddy move, your chief minister slipped and fell flat in a rice paddy. You helped him up, adjusted his hat and said, "Even the land is bowing to your wisdom." He tried to laugh, failed. You both walked on in silence. But that moment, dry, absurd, real, sticks with people. You've never given a grand speech, never launched a major campaign, but through it all you remain present. And in an age of betrayal and shifting sands, presence is power. You aren't a warrior. You're a compass, a symbol, a reason to keep walking. It's the middle of summer, and the air is thick enough to slice. Even the crickets seem exhausted. You fan yourself slowly with a worn bamboo paddle, watching your generals argue from opposite corners of the audience chamber. They're your allies. Technically, these are the men who have sworn loyalty to your court, who hoist your name on their banners, and whisper reverently about the legitimacy of the Southern line. And yet, they don't always act like it. Lord Kusunoki Masanori wants to raid the western provinces. Again, Lord Nita Yoshinaga insists the eastern borders are far more vulnerable. Again, and Lord Kutabata, he just wants someone to bring him decent soba noodles. You nod politely as they debate, knowing full well that they will do what they wish regardless of your opinion. This is the dance you've grown used to, where the emperor gives approval after the decisions have already been made. Your authority floats above them like a cloud, soft, ceremonial and easy to ignore. It wasn't always this way. In the beginning, your supporters rallied with fire in their eyes. They spoke of restoring imperial rule, reclaiming Kyoto, and avenging your father's exile. There were even minor victories, brief flashes of momentum, where it seemed like just maybe the tide might turn. But those moments faded. The Ashikaga proved too entrenched, too well-funded, too politically savvy. And so your warlords settled into a rhythm of localized resistance, part loyalty, part self-interest. You understand. The empire, as it once was, is fractured beyond repair. Now each province is its own tiny world, ruled by men who claim to serve the emperor while mostly serving themselves. You still send them scrolls though. You still write proclamations. You still bless their banners, and attend the ceremonial departures when they march to war. It's the form that matters. The pretense of unity. The story of a single court, even if it's stitched together with stubborn thread. And sometimes, surprisingly, one of them listens. Lord Masanori once rerouted his entire campaign to protect a temple you personally favored. Lord Kutabatake, for all his whining, defended a village of imperial farmers, when he could have easily claimed their land. These are small gestures, but they matter. They show that your presence, quiet, ceremonial, almost spectral, still shapes the actions of men with swords. Historians still argue whether your generals truly believed in your cause, or simply used it as a noble pretext for local power grabs. Probably both. Human motives are rarely neat. They're more like a tangled scroll with half the ink smudged. But here's the truth you've come to accept. Your power is not in commanding, but in anchoring. You are the figure they orbit, the shrine at the center of their storm, the emperor who asks little, demands less, and offers just enough ceremony to keep the idea of an empire alive. You learn to wield that idea with care. A whisper of disapproval can guide a general's decision more than 1,000 shouted orders. A public poem, dedicated to a warlord's late father, can buy you a season of loyalty. A silent nod at a strategy meeting, just once, can be interpreted as imperial blessing or polite condemnation, depending on the recipient's mood. And so you navigate, with no army of your own, with no fortress, no treasury, and only 2/3 of the sacred regalia. Still they gather in your name, still they bow before your ink-stained sleeves. Still you endure, and some days, that feels like victory. You're reviewing documents when the news arrives. The repairs to the shrine have been delayed. Again, this is not surprising. Nothing ever arrives on time anymore. Not the rice, not the messengers, and certainly not the carpenters. Still you sigh. This particular shrine was supposed to be a symbol, a quiet statement that the southern court, despite being exiled and perpetually mobile, still upheld the sacred duties of the emperor, the stewardship of Shinto rituals, the honor of ancient deities, the continuity of tradition. Instead, the structure now resembles a very elaborate pile of timber surrounded by apologetic monks. You remember when the project began. It was supposed to be modest, just a gentle restoration of a crumbling inner sanctum. But every noble who visited wanted to contribute, which meant adding more lanterns, more columns, more engraved plaques. Suddenly you had a 5-year project, and not nearly enough nails. But you kept pushing, because maintaining sacred sites is one of the few things you can still do without interference from Ashikaga sabers. They may have Kyoto, but they do not own your reverence. And besides, a working shrine does more than honor the gods. It anchors the morale of your court. Every time the court performs a purification rite, or recites an ancient chant before the new moon, something stirs in your people. It's subtle, just a small straightening of the back, a softer intake of breath, but for a few moments everyone feels that the old order still stands, even if the palace walls don't. So you persist. You reassign workers. You cut silk allocations from the poetry hall, which causes great drama, and redirect them to the shrine team. You approve a request for 30 extra lantern tassels, but quietly veto the gilded dragon carving that someone thought was spirited. You get your hands metaphorically dirty overseeing the sequence of rituals, consulting weather signs, choosing the festival date. You even compose a poem for the new dedication scroll, which includes a clever pun on missed and forgotten promises. Your scribes call it one of your best. You pretend to be modest. You are not. But the shrine isn't just a spiritual project. It's politic. You send news of the reconstruction to friendly provinces. You invite minor lords to sponsor a lantern, a bench, a roof tile. They respond, not with armies, but with quiet nods and small gifts. A carved incense holder, a bundle of cedar planks, a painting of a white fox curled beneath a tree. Even distant temples begin sending you relics and offerings, acknowledging your spiritual leadership even if they remain neutral in the war. It's subtle diplomacy, filtered through incense smoke and temple bells. And as you sit under the half-finished eaves of the shrine, watching craftsmen mutter over timber knots, you realize something strange. This feels like rulership. Maybe not the sword-wielding, decree-shouting kind, but the real kind, the invisible kind. Historians often gloss over this part of your reign. It doesn't make for thrilling reading, but it matters. These quiet acts of stewardship, of honoring shrines, preserving rituals and protecting sacred sites, become the threads that keep the southern court from unraveling complete. And long after you're gone, when all the castles have fallen, and even the Ashikaga shogunate fades into dust, these rituals will still be performed, these lanterns will still be lit, not because you commanded it, but because you quietly made it possible.
The scroll you're handed is smutted with rain and ash, the corners curled like wilted leaves. Your attendant bows low and murmurs, "Another letter from the countryside. Your Majesty, they're not sure where to send these anymore." Of course they aren't. No one knows where you are half the time, and sometimes you don't either until you wake up and smell the particular wood in the beams. Was this the temple by the river, or the monastery with the noisy storks? You've grown used to this kind of ambiguity. The southern court by now has developed a curious habit of drifting. Not just physically though. Yes, your palace is more tent than citadel, but also symbolically. There's a peculiar sort of freedom in being unpinned. You are not anchored to Kyoto. You are not expected to receive ambassadors or host foreign dignitaries. You are not tracked on every map. You are unplaceable. And the world finds that both confusing and oddly impressive. Messengers arrive days late, apologizing for having searched the wrong mountain. Officials from distant provinces begin their letters with, "To His Majesty," wherever he may graciously reside. One courtier jokes that you've become a spirit of the forest, a kami in silk robes. Historians still argue whether this elusiveness was strategy or accident. Some suggest your court intentionally kept its location vague to avoid Ashikaga attacks. Others claim it was simply a result of poor roads and limited paper. But regardless, the result is the same. You are everywhere and nowhere. Your court is more like a caravan than a government. You've got sacred relics packed in lacquer boxes, a portable altar that folds like origami, and a court musician who swears he can play his zither while riding a mule. He can't, but the effort is admirable. You sleep in temples, mountain huts, even once in a way station normally reserved for wandering monks. You wake to the sound of bells or birds, sometimes both. You take your morning tea while looking out at valleys that will forget your name the moment you leave. And in this strange fugitive rhythm, you've discovered something unexpected, clarity. Because when you are hard to find, people start to mythologize you. Stories sprout like moss of the emperor, who rides the wind, who travels with foxes, who sleeps beneath ancient cedar trees, and speaks only in poems. Not true, of course. You sometimes snore. You've tripped over your own hem more than once. But still the stories grow. Even your enemies begin to hesitate. How do you conquer a court that isn't in one place? How do you destroy a throne that refuses to sit still? The Ashikaga may have Kyoto, but they cannot surround you, because you are not surrounded. You begin to think of your court not as a single place but as a constellation. Ministers here, monks there, a poet in one province, a loyal smith in another, the emperor in the center. Yes, but the center is mobile, shifting. And through this haze of movement, something astonishing happens. You persist. Most governments need buildings, budgets, boundaries. But you survive on ritual and rumor, on loyalty and paper-thin grace. You have no fixed address, but your presence is felt more than some who sit on marble thrones. Because power isn't always about place. Sometimes power is the fact that people still look for you. The sun glints faintly off your sleeve as you inspect the latest parcel from a regional noble, a box of finely woven garments modeled after ancient Heian court robes, rich brocades, silken layers dyed with muted natural hues, sleeves long enough to make writing an accident waiting to happen. You smile, gently. It's not just a gift, it's a gesture, a nod to your role as keeper of elegance in an era that's otherwise become quite stabby. The Ashikaga and their puppets may march around in grim utilitarian armor, but you have taken a different path. Your court leans backward into time, reviving customs and attire that would have seemed old-fashioned even a century earlier. It started with small things, a change in court titles, a return to earlier etiquette, a suggestion that incense ceremonies could be hosted more frequently. Then came the garments, the robes, the layers, the sleeves that sweep the floors like dignified curtains. Some call it nostalgic, some call it impractical, you call it imperial. You know you don't have the armies, you know you don't have Kyoto, but you do have something the Ashikaga can't forge in a smithy, cultural legitimacy, so you lean into it like a poet leans into melancholy. Your officials are required to memorize passages from Genji. Your palace scrolls include etiquette guides last updated in. You reinstate the court position of sleeve-tucking steward, whose sole job is to ensure that ceremonial robes don't trip anyone important during festivals. It's a position previously discontinued because someone did trip and it caused a diplomatic incident involving spilled ink and a furious goose. Not that you're unaware of the absurdity. You've had moments standing under a collapsing roof, holding a fan stitched with moon verses, where even you have to chuckle at the contrast, but still you persist. Because in this revival of formality, you're doing more than play acting, you're preserving something rare: continuity. In an age where swords redraw borders faster than ink can dry, where generals build their own dynasties, and Kyoto echoes with clanging armor, your court remains the last outpost of the old world, the world of poets and priests, of layered meaning, of elegance as authority. And your people, your scattered loyal few, notice. A farmer who never met you still teaches his son the bowing protocol he heard from a wandering monk. A young scribe in the outer provinces dreams of one day copying imperial poetry onto real mulberry paper. A merchant sends you incense, not because he supports your cause, but because he wants to smell the court that remembers how things used to be. Historians still argue whether your court's return to tradition was meaningful or merely decorative. Some say it was all aesthetic, a silk mask on a withering structure. Others insist it was a quiet revolution, the insistence that beauty and ritual could be a form of resistance. But you just adjust your robes and sip your tea. You know what you're doing, because while everyone else scrambles for control of the now, you are safeguarding the then. And when the future finally looks back, they may find in your wardrobe not just fabric, but a thread of continuity that held Japan's heart in place. You're seated beneath the open lattice of the east veranda, brush in hand, surrounded by scrolls. Some are official decrees, some are thank you notes. Most, though, are letters, endless letters to lords, scholars, monks, cousins, people you've never met, and people who may no longer exist. Your daily life is less like commanding an empire and more like managing a very slow-moving post office, with delusions of grandeur. But oh, how you write! Your handwriting is admired even by critics. Your prose is elegant, balanced, and full of seasonal flourishes, because nothing says urgent political appeal like a metaphor about plum blossoms in late rain. Letter writing has become your signature act. It's your way of reaching out when your armies can't. You don't launch invasion. You don't deliver fiery speeches from balconies, but you do craft sentences so carefully that one lord once claimed your third paragraph alone changed his loyalty. He may have been exaggerating, or lonely, or both. Most of your letters follow a gentle pattern. Open with a poetic observation about nature, reference an old event or ancestor to build rapport, mention shared values, politely express disappointment that the recipient hasn't responded to previous correspondence. Repeat your request. End with another poem, because why not? You do this again and again, day after day, sometimes dictating 3 scrolls before breakfast. A courier hands you a message from a clan in Kyushu, and you pause for a moment, sip tea, then begin again, as the cicadas cry in the heat of the 7th moon. Some of these messages reach their targets, others disappear into the mountain mist. Occasionally a reply comes, usually apologetic, sometimes cryptic. Once you received a response written entirely in the form of a linked poem chain. It was beautiful, and completely unhelpful. Still you persist, because you understand something most don't. Writing is rulership. You may not have troops, but your words cross borders. They enter homes, courts, temples. They rest on scroll racks, passed from hand to hand, read aloud by candlelight. Your letters remind people that the emperor is still here, still watching, still trying. You've heard stories, amusing, frustrating, oddly touching, about how your letters have been used. A noblewoman copied your poem into her diary and wept. A rice tax collector framed your edict on his wall, ignoring it entirely. A monk used one as a bookmark in a sutra,
where it remained for 30 years before rediscovery. Historians still debate the practical value of your correspondence. Some argue it was empty ritual, others insist it maintained a crucial thread of communication in a nation fraying at the edge. But the fact is, your scrolls did more than plead. They connected. They reminded the fractured provinces that there was still a center, even if that center had holes in the roof and a court musician who played everything in a minor key by accident. You once joked that if war is fire, your letters are dew, soft, persistent, and invisible, but shaping the landscape all the same. And somewhere in that there's power. You're preparing for a seasonal ceremony, nothing grand, just a midsummer purification rite, when a court aide rushes in, whispering urgently, "The Ashikaga have paraded the sword through Kyoto again." The sword, one of the 3 sacred treasures of Japan, the imperial regalia, the curved blade that represents valor and legitimacy, the one you are supposed to possess, along with the mirror and the jewel. But you don't. Technically, neither does the Ashikaga, because well, the actual sword was lost years ago, possibly dropped in the sea during a battle, possibly stolen, possibly spirited away by a monk with very specific plans. Historians still argue whether the sword on display in Kyoto is the real one, or a stand-in crafted by someone with too much lacquer and ambition. Still, the optics are undeniable. Kyoto has a sword. You do not. It stings, not because you're obsessed with symbols, but because you know how much symbols matter. In Japan, power doesn't always come from force, it comes from continuity. And the regalia are more than artifacts. They are the proof of a divine line, a bridge between earth and heaven. So you do what you can. You hold on to the mirror and the jewel. You protect them like the last embers of an ancient fire. You move them carefully from palace to palace, temple to temple, always under guard, always with reverence. You oversee their cleaning yourself. You assign monks to recite sutras in their presence. You treat them not as tools of power, but as sacred companions. But still you feel the absence of the sword. You try to respond with quiet dignity. You write a statement for your court's ears only, reminding them that a real emperor needs no metal to prove his strength, that the sword lives in the spirit of the court, in the resistance of the provinces, in the ink of every loyal poem. It helps, a little. Then just when you're beginning to forget the wound, someone at court starts spreading rumors again that you never had any of the regalia, that perhaps the mirror is just a bronze plate, and the jewel a glass bob. You sigh, assign a scribe to write a polite rebuttal, and then hold a moon viewing party to distract everyone. It works. The rice cakes are excellent. But deep down you know this. The regalia matter not just to the scholars and priests, but to you, because they anchor you in a reign with no capital, no clear territory, no crown but your combed hair and folded robes. They give you center. And maybe that's enough, because despite the mock parades in Kyoto, despite the whispers, despite the missing sword and the fake one gleaming in Ashikaga hands, you're still here. The rituals still continue, the chant lines still pass from old voices to young ears. The imperial lineage is still traced back through your name. Historians often get stuck on this point. How could a ruler have any legitimacy without all 3 treasures? They ask. Others respond, how could a shogun's puppet possess any, even with them? The truth is grayer, as usual, but you've learned to live in the gray, to rule in the in-between, to lead a kingdom that exists more in belief than geography. And in that strange space, even a lost sword casts a long shadow, one you've learned to walk alongside.
The scent of roasted barley tea drifts lazily through the open hall, mixing with a distant note of pine sap and dust. You're seated cross-legged, half listening to a monk recite sutras, when a courtier bursts in, breathless, hair askew, eyes sparkling. "Your Majesty," he pants, "we have received a tea bowl." You blink. "Wait. A tea bowl?" "Yes," he beams. "From a potter in the north. He says it bears blessings for the emperor's strength and calm." You nod slowly. It's the 5th such gift this month. Apparently, you've become the unexpected icon of serenity. It's a peculiar development. Somewhere between your silence, your letter writing, your poetry contests, and your steady, mostly uneventful reign, people have started romanticizing your stillness. Not in the military sense. No one's confusing you with a general, but in the spiritual sense. The philosophical one. The emperor as still pond reflecting a chaotic world. 1. It starts small. A poem here, a scroll there. Then a few gifted trinkets. Simple things. Lovingly made. A carved fan. A pressed lotus. A painting of you meditating under a pine tree. Even though you're pretty sure that never happened. You're not bad at meditating. But you do tend to fall asleep. Then come the stories. A traveling merchant swears he saw you calm a storm with your breath. A monk claims you spoke only 3 words during a winter ceremony, and a sparrow laid an egg on your shoulder. Someone else says you predicted an eclipse with your tea leaves. None of it's true. You're fairly sure. Still the image spreads. You are now not only Emperor Go Murakami, ruler of the southern court, but also Emperor Go Murakami, gentle oracle of calm. Your court doesn't fight it. If anything, they lean in. They start telling stories in soft voices over evening fires, letting the myths deepen like ink in water. Your steward begins organizing your public appearances to heighten the atmosphere of composed mystery. Fewer sudden movements, more pauses. You're asked to frown less. You didn't know you were frowning. At one point, someone suggests you adopt a white crane to follow you around for symbolism. You say no, politely. And you? You begin to play the part. Not because you believe the stories, but because you see what they're doing. They give your people something to hold on to. A narrative. A reason. In a time of uncertainty, you become a mirror of grace, of balance, of perseverance without aggression. It's not about power. It's about presence. So when the tea bowl arrives, you receive it personally. You turn it slowly in your hands, admiring the simple glazing, the honest curve of the rim. You ask that it be used for tonight's gathering, even though the lacquered set is more formal. During the evening tea, you raise the bowl. It's slightly uneven, beautifully so. You sip quietly. Then you set it down and say, "This bowl holds peace better than most hands." Your ministers nod, pens already scribbling. The phrase will be quoted, decorated, probably painted onto someone's door by tomorrow. Historians much later will find all this either inspiring or absurd. Some will call it a brilliant adaptation of imperial soft power. Others will roll their eyes and mutter about performative detachment. But none of them will taste the tea you just drank, or feel the hush in the room that followed, or see how without lifting a blade, without shouting a command, you reminded your people that peace is still possible, even if it's poured into a slightly lopsided cup. You wake to bird song, and the faint knock of a wooden ladle against a water basin. Someone performing morning ablutions in the courtyard. A familiar sacred rhythm. The sun has barely risen, but your chamber is already stirring with movement. Today, however, something feels different. You sit up slowly. Your joints complain in the gentle, familiar way they always do now. Your robes are folded beside you, carefully laid out. Incense is already lit. Someone's remembered your preference for the cedar blend again. A quiet footstep. Then another. Your steward enters, bows low and tells you the news. Your son, Prince Norinaga, is returning. After years of being stationed further south, rallying the remnants of loyal clans, maintaining ties with wayward temples, he has finally come back. You nod and your breath catches a little in your throat. Because you know, it's time. You're not dying. Not yet. But the quiet certainty has taken root. Your body moves slower. Your voice fades sooner. And your once endless scroll writing sessions now end after just a few pages. You've ruled longer than anyone expected. You've kept the court together, if not in strength, then in spirit. And now as the mist settles across the ridge and the bell tolls the hour, it's time to begin the quiet handover. Your son arrives before noon. He bows low, lower than required, and you see the wear in his face. He's older than you were when you took the throne. His hands are rougher. His speech clipped. He's grown into a man of forests and war camps, not poetry and incense. And yet there's something unmistakably imperial about him. You share a meal together. Simple rice, a sliver of pickled daikon, and a soup that's too salty, but neither of you complains. The words come slowly, not because you're formal, but because there's too much between you to unwrap all at once. Still, you tell him of the mountain paths, of the times you hid the mirror in a bundle of straw,
Of the night the musicians played through a thunderstorm. You speak of diplomacy as breath control, of ruling as listening, of power not as command, but as continuity. You tell him about the regalia, the missing sword, the letters, the lords who vanished, the ones who stayed. You tell him he'll probably never set foot in Kyoto. He nods. Then you say something that you hadn't planned to. Don't try to be like me. Just remember who you are. He bows again, deeper this time, and you see something in his eyes. Not ambition, not fire, but steadiness. The kind you've spent your whole life cultivating. That night you step aside. Not with ceremony, not with fanfare, but with a nod. He will take your place. The court will adjust. The incense will still burn. The chants will still echo. The poems will still be read aloud to near empty rooms. And somewhere a scribe will still meticulously copy your letters by lamplight. Historians will note that after your reign, very little changed. And that perhaps is your final gift. Because in an age of upheaval, you made sure something lasted. Not through triumph, but through quiet resilience. Not through conquest, but through endurance. So you spend your remaining days in a small wing of the palace, tending the garden, watching the sun play on the water basin, teaching the youngest court page how to hold a brush properly. You pass not with a cry, but with a whisper. And even then, the southern court moves gently on, exactly as you designed. It's quiet now, not just the usual hush of a pine-framed palace at dusk, but the deeper, weightier silence that follows the end of a chapter. Your son has taken the reins carefully, cautiously, like someone handling a sacred object, wrapped in fragile cloth. He speaks softly during court. He wears his robes a little less perfectly than you did. His handwriting is too fast. But he learns, and most importantly he listens. You've taken on a quieter role, almost spectral in nature. You attend ceremonies but rarely speak. You walk the garden paths each morning, nodding to scribes and stable boys alike. You review the occasional scroll, and correct court poetry with a slight twitch of your sleeve. Some still bow to you out of habit. Some do it because to them you'll always be the true emperor. You accept this with grace. You don't need titles anymore. You've become something else entirely. A president. And with your withdrawal from the center of court life, something curious begins to happen. The myth of you begins to take form. Not just the whispered stories of your serenity or the exaggerations of your letter-writing powers, but a fuller image crafted by those who loved you, feared you, didn't understand you. They start calling your reign the still years. Monks chant sutras using verses you composed. A distant temple builds a small alcove, labeled Go Murakami's refuge, even though you never visited. Children recite tales of your mountain journeys as if they were fairy stories. Historians still don't know what to make of it. Some write you off as a placeholder in an age of chaos. Others paint you as the spiritual counterpoint to Ashikaga ambition, but most are simply confused. How can someone do so little, and yet remain so firmly in the folds of history? But you know the answer. You've always known. Your reign wasn't about conquest. It was about constancy. You preserved the sacred rites when others abandoned them. You wrote letters when swords failed. You kept the ember of the southern court glowing even when no one believed it could last another winter. And now, watching your son seated on the lacquered dais, you feel the quiet satisfaction of a gardener who sees the first green shoot rise after a long frost. The court continues, the ceremonies endure, the banners still bear your family's emblem. And though you no longer guide the empire's pen, your fingerprints remain on every scroll. One night, a courtier asks if you regret never returning to Kyoto. You smile, say nothing, because even without the city, without the full regalia, without armies or applause, you ruled with something deeper than conquest. You ruled with persistence, and in the end it is the quiet that remains. The days pass like leaves drifting down a slow-moving stream, soft, unhurried. You no longer rise at dawn unless you wish to. The court functions without your hand, but not without your presence. You are the shadow at the edge of the scroll, the calm behind the ceremony. Sometimes you're asked to give a word of blessing, a seasonal poem, a passing comment, a quiet smile, And somehow those gestures hold more power now than any edict you wrote years ago. You're no longer emperor in title, but your image has crystallized into something even more enduring. The symbol of patience. In an age of fire, the eye of a storm that never quite stopped spinning. Your son governs well enough. He falters as all rulers, but he always returns to your example. Your restraint, your rituals, your refusal to collapse when everything else was burning. You observe from a small study with a view of the cedar grove. Birds nest in the same branches each spring. A child in the courtyard mispronounces a verse from the tale of Genji and laughs. You smile. These are the victories no record will mark. But they are yours nonetheless. At times you reread old scrolls, your own letters preserved like fossils in faded ink. Some make you proud, some make you wince. A few contain lines you no longer remember writing, as if another version of you whispered them through the fog of survival. One night during a mild spring thunderstorm, you sit by the open screen doors, watching the rain roll off the eaves in steady rhythm. Your breathing is slower now, your hands are less steady, but your mind, if anything, is clearer than ever. You think of your father, so bold, so determined. You think of Takoji, the general who made empires from chaos. You think of the sword you never touched, and the city you never ruled. And then you think of the way your court still bows with grace, how your lineage endures, how the chants continue without interruption, how your quiet reign lasted longer than anyone dared expect. Historians still argue whether your era mattered. Some call it a placeholder, others a lull, but you know better. You were the pause that protected the song, the breath before the next verse, the steady flame that warmed the hands of a fading world. Wind down. And now, dear listener, as the final echoes of our stories settle like evening dust, you can feel the hush of the past, wrapping gently around your thoughts. You've walked beside an emperor who did not conquer lands, but cultivated silence, who did not storm cities, but steadied a legacy with ink, incense, and quiet breath, who didn't change the world through force, but preserved its shape when it could have crumbled completely. Let that quiet strength linger with you tonight. Let the steady rituals of a distant misty court remind you that not every chapter must be loud to be lasting. Close your eyes now, and drift through the forest paths of Yamato. Let your thoughts wander down a trail lined with bamboo and memory. You hear distant wind chime, a monk's footsteps on moss, a brush's whisper across parchment. The world will always have its chaos, but there is peace, still in a robe folded just so, in a verse recited under the moon, in a life lived without spectacle, yet filled with meaning. So let the reign of Go Murakami, long and uneventful as it was, ease you into sleep like an old poem that ends not with a shout, but with a sigh. Soft breaths, steady heart. You are safe here. The lights are dim, the incense is fading. The story has been told. Sweet dreams.